Hello, and welcome to this edition of Open Source in Oman, a monthly series of video interviews brought to you by the Open Source Center of Excellence in Oman, a partnership between the Oman Ministry of Transport, Communication and Information Technology, and Wipro Limited. I'm your host, Gilles Gravier, Open Source Strategy Advisor at Wipro. Our guest today is Tobie Langel, who is founder and open source strategy consultant at UnlockOpen in Switzerland. In his role, he's been very naturally, significantly involved in open source activities, which we will discuss together during our session. Hi, Tobie.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Super. Let's start with an introduction. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into open source originally?
Sure. Okay. So this is a funny and old story at this point. Originally, I wasn't in technology at all. I was a professional musician, and as a very young musician, I was touring with a band, and it turned out that the person that was closest to technology in the band was my brother, and so I was tasked with figuring out how to build a website for the band. And so he helped me out. Back then, it was the PHP MySQL stack. So that's how I learned CSS and HTML and all of the early sort of like web technology. And what happened is I released that website was has helped and really got hooked into the building aspects of technology, like the really concrete hands-on aspects. And very quickly, all of my musicians friends in Geneva, where I live, looked at my website, at the band's website, and were like, "Oh, wow, this is amazing. Can you build one for us?" And I just really saw there like an opportunity to sort of add some side revenue to a musician's revenue, which, as everyone knows, is tragically small. And so that's kind of how I got started into tech. And shortly after that, I bumped into Ruby on Rails, which was like a big thing when I started. So at those back then, and the JavaScript libraries that Ruby on Rails was using to do all of the really cool things on the browser. And I essentially learned by digging into the source code of those and documenting them. So I came to open source essentially by learning as a learning tool, and my first contributions to open source were documentation, which is something that we kind of forget today, that open source is not just about code, right? It's also about everything that's around it, and that's how I started.
Oh, absolutely. This is super interesting. By the way, I really didn't know that about you, even though we've known each other for a long, long time. I was at a super big conference in Geneva with diplomats and people like that recently, and the guy who was controlling all of the video equipment for doing recordings, multi-cameras, etc., was using a Raspberry Pi to pilot his console. So, from your start to today in 2021, open source is in art and media all over the place. That's a really cool story, by the way. Thank you. So what's the main personal motivation for you today when it comes to your open source activities? Again, today, and has it evolved over time? How did that change, or has it changed?
So it has changed significantly, actually. I think one of the main reasons why it changed is as I grew older, two things happened. First, technology evolves at an increasingly fast pace, sorry, and just keeping up to date was what the latest tech you're supposed to know as an engineer. Essentially, I just got too old for that. That's the reality of it. It felt like an endless catching up was change, and having a family, wanting to have a better work-life balance. I thought, like, I can't do this. Like, I no longer have the energy and the drive to like keep up with what's going on. And I mean, I want to be fair here. It is probably the perspective of someone starting in tech today is probably different. They have the same energy that this young drive that I had back then, But there's a clearer understanding today that you don't have to know the whole stack. You don't have to know how to build an app and also deploy it. Like there's a better sense that these things are split. When I started, like you do design, user interface, user experience, code, backend, deploying, the whole thing, right? And wanting to keep up with all of that just became essentially impossible. So that's the first step. And then the second part is, as tech went, and frankly, open source for that matter, went from being something that was extremely niche, right? Like techies, you have all the kind of memes and kind of like idea of what that looks like, right? And then it became completely mainstream. And that shift also meant that tech moved from being very much about folks working by themselves on like very complex technological problems into how do you get people to work together and to consider their role and in a business and in society, right? And so as a result, I kind of like took a step away from the tech itself and started focusing on how do you build tech, what works, what makes it effective, how can you turn organizations into tech-driven, effective organizations. So that's kind of like the shift really that I did. It's to take that step away and start looking at the bigger picture and consider and sort of like center my focus on the human interactions within technology rather than just the technology itself.
Cool. Okay, man, what a story actually, and yeah, some of us with gray hair have had kind of this evolution as well, right? So I can relate to that very much.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Careful what you say there.
I was just, you pointed to your beard saying gray hair, and I'm like, well, actually, you have more gray hair on your beard than I do.
I do.
So hence, I can imagine.
So tell me about UnlockOpen a little bit. What does open source, what role does open source play in what you do? Everything, maybe, right?
Well, so that's an interesting question because, as I was saying, so UnlockOpen is my consulting vehicle, if you will, right? And it's essentially a firm that is centered around my consulting work. I have a few people that help on a part-time basis, on a contractual basis for specific projects, but essentially it's me helping out clients, right? And so as a result, like, again, the main focus of it obviously is open source and open standards too, and the intersection between these things. But it's really around the human and organizational aspects of open source, not that much about the code itself. And I have a very pragmatic approach to running a business and open source, which is when I'm running a business, like I pick the tools that are right for the job, and I think about the trade-offs between whether that tool is open and I'll be able to continue using it in the future. I think a lot about open standards. So when I create, for example, like intellectual property or code, I think about doing it in a way where I know that I'm in control and that I'm in control of those assets and can move them around. But when it comes to actually using software, I use whatever makes the most sense from a business perspective now, right? And so I'm running a lot of my business on a closed stack. That's the unfortunate reality. But I still code actually quite a bit because I really, really like the coding aspects, the doing aspects of code. And a lot of what I do when I do it, that is open source. And relies obviously on an open source stack, right? Because when you're coding, you're essentially building on top of like this existing network of open source. But it's mainly software that I use for myself or for example, look for stats or data around open source usage in a particular project. So calls to APIs, that kind of work. So I don't really produce open source as a business, right? But I advise people on how to do that and how to work in that realm. And I still use a lot of open source when I code.
Regarding your role today, can you tell us how you arrived actually in that role? How does it how does it evolve in open source?
Well, I'm going to try to make another long story short here. I worked from 2010 to I think late 2013 at Facebook and at W3C. Both. So I ended up being a W3C fellow on behalf of Facebook, which meant I was actually embedded within W3C, but on a Facebook payroll. My role there, so I was working in this open standards and open source team at Facebook, where I was driving the standards aspect. And I had been invited to work at Facebook in standards because I didn't have a standards background. And so what they wanted was someone that understood the open source culture well, and that cared about standardization, but wasn't sort of like an old style standards person. So I did that there for those like 3 years. And when I left, I went to work as a consultant in the standardization space and wrote a whole bunch of specs in that space around the web stack. And so that was really my initial focus. But again, sort of like the same thing that I was describing before happened, which was, well, once you've really written the specs and know how that stuff works, it's sort of how can you scale? How can you impact be not just about the work that you do, but how can you multiply that impact by essentially transforming the way people work? And trying to shape the industry into adopting these things. So I think that's the main that's kind of how I went from again from doing to thinking more strategically about things, and then explaining essentially turning that into a consulting business rather than selling the output of me creating the technology. So helping organizations build that know-how and that culture so that they could be doing that. Yeah, I think there was a second part to your question, but I think I sort of missed what the second point was.
Yeah, so how does your role involve open source itself? But I think we know already a little bit about that. So you covered both in the answer, I think.
Okay, good. Wonderful.
So what are the biggest challenges you face today in your role, and what helps you resolve them successfully?
That's a great question. So I think the challenges, so there's a number of challenges. I think in the work that I do, so the biggest challenge is always human relationships. And I want to be clear, and I'm not saying that that's the biggest challenge for me. Like, I'm actually making the point that this is the biggest challenge, right? Once you go above one or two people in a room writing software, and you start having software as the backbone of governments, of companies, of organizations in the world, then essentially it is how these organizations communicate and function that becomes the biggest challenge. And that boils down to how people talk to each other and communicate, right? So I think like that is the biggest challenge. More concretely, in my work, the biggest challenge that I see is that the shift from a culture, well, I have to back up a little bit here and explain sort of my perspective on what open source is and how it fits in organizations today. So briefly, we've seen over the last, I would say, 2 decades, a complete transformation of essentially every industry, including governments, from from not having any software at all, right, to purchasing software through vendors to fulfill sort of like specific missions, how you would purchase like a phone line or cars or cleaning services for your offices or real estate, right? That's what digital transformation is, right? It's that shift from considering software as a thing that you purchase to considering software as the backbone on which you build a business, regardless of whether your business or your organization is a tech organization or not, right? Everything today is tech. And that transition, it's not just a thing that you buy, it's a complete cultural transformation of your organization. It's a completely different way of thinking. It's a different way of perceiving software. It's a different way of perceiving technology. It's a different way of perceiving your relationship with clients. It's really different. And open source sits really at the center of this for two reasons. First reason is today, like so much software is open source. Open source is everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. So you just can't ignore the fact that like what makes your backbone, right? The calcium of software is open source. That's what it's built with, right? So you just can't ignore that. That's the first reason. And the second reason is that the cultural aspects of open source are exactly the way that you build software across organizational boundaries, that you come together with different personal agendas, and that the outcome of those agendas and those different people clashing creates great software, like better software that you would get otherwise. That is really key to this whole digital transformation, right? And so the making aspects of open source are key to digital transformation. And cultural shifts like this, I'm going to answer the question, right? So once you have this understanding of what open source is about and what role it plays in the way organizations are transforming today from their old selves to these new tech-centered organizations, or as some have put, essentially get disrupted by new players in the field, right? So this transformation is centered around open source, right? And is a huge cultural shift. And that's what I help organizations do. And the huge cultural shifts are hard, right? And organizations today tend a lot to think from a quarter-to-quarter basis because of the fact that they're shareholder driven, and that's how the stock market works, et cetera, et cetera. And so making the case for doing something today that's going to transform your business in the course of the next 5 years, that is necessary for the business to survive and thrive in the future, is hard, right? And I think that's my biggest challenge, is understanding the long-term impact of what digital transformation means, and getting my clients and organizations that I work with to actually be ready to make those bets and get started on that journey with wins on a day-to-day basis, but also a long-term vision. So I think that's the biggest challenge. God, that was a really long answer.
And you only answered the first part. How do you resolve that challenge?
Oh my God, this is a I think so. This is a huge cultural question today. When we look at how do we handle COVID, when we look at how do we handle the climate crisis, it's the same kind of questions, right? as a society, as a culture today, we are having real issues thinking long term, right? So that like there's a real problem here. So that's a non-answer to that question. But however, there's a second answer that actually I think is really important, and that goes into how you build startups, lean startup, et cetera, right? Which is, well, if what you're trying to do is build a car, right? Well, maybe start was, like a small bicycle, or like something simple, right? And so essentially, create like small wins and work iteratively. Make sure that you can get to something today and build on top of that tomorrow, et cetera, et cetera. So the challenge is building today was long-term in mind, right? And yeah, you resolve it by getting everyone invested in the long-term vision, and showing that this long-term vision creates progress and better outcomes now.
Cool, thank you. Wow. So apart from the project you work on, or the projects you work on, what's your favorite open source project? Do you have a favorite open source project?
I'm going to answer the second question. I don't. I have. I think that what I like the best about open source, rather than a specific project, is the way people come together to work on something, and the way people come together from completely different backgrounds and find a way to create value, and create a community out of essentially the tiniest intersection and interest. I find that so beautiful. That's what I love about the humankind. I can go a bit philosophical here, but there's something amazing to see people from completely different parts of the world come together to fix, I don't know, a drag and drop library for a web client, and have passionate conversations about this. So that would be sort of my non-answer. If I had to give a real answer to this, I think I would go to the first project that I was really involved with, which was the prototype JavaScript library, because I learned to code using that project, right? I had no idea what was going on. I just like looked at this and I was, oh, when you do this, this happens. Okay, that's interesting. So maybe this is, I don't know, what happens when you change, right? So I think like my heart is really back there. And I think the other thing that I really, when I think about another open source project that I've been involved with that I really like, it's a really small open source project that I created when I was working on standards, actually, to help with a standard I was working on, to help display it when we were doing GitHub reviews of changes in that standard, and that I built for myself. And that's a really tiny project, and that people really liked, and that I actually turned into a small service. And now like the whole community of people building web standards for years is relying on this. And I'm still sort of like making sure that the server that on which it runs, it like gets paid for, right? But I haven't touched it in years, and it works. And it's like, it saved like probably thousands of hours to people writing specs for the web today. And I just like, that's what I love about open source, right? It's like tiny people working on something tiny somewhere that just have like this kind of unexpected and broad impact, even if it's a tiny project. That's what I really like about it.
I'm sure people are going to want to know how this works and where it's accessible. You'll have to send me a URL that I'll put in the YouTube page if you agree with that.
I will do that. Absolutely. Sure. Yeah.
Good. Thanks. Maybe as a first conclusion, you have an ask for our audience. What could they do to make your open source activities easier, better, more efficient?
So let me think about this a bit. I think that people need, like everybody today, need to understand that the value of open source is the practice of making it. the practice of coming together and building things that are not going to be a competitive advantage for your business or your organization or your country or whatever it is, right? But that are going to be a useful building block for lots of different use cases. And that the practice is the thing that's valuable. That's what's going to make you understand how the software works, and is going to essentially, by building blocks, you're learning how to build, right? And by learning how to build, you essentially becoming in charge of your own ability to build your own things for your own purposes. So I think if people can, I mean, of course it's contributing to open source. Of course that's great and that's useful, right? But more importantly, I think what's important is for people to understand that what's in it for them as individuals and as organizations sponsoring individuals to do that. So it's really about understanding that by working collectively on something, everyone is coming out, like it's pure value creation. Everyone's coming out with more, right? More understanding and more knowledge, a better network, better relationships, ideas about how others are using that software. All of these things that are like really, really greatly useful. So yeah, understand that by giving, you can actually be creating value for yourself.
This goes back to the culture change you were mentioning earlier on.
Yes,
about,
absolutely.
Absolutely, cool.
And I would like to say, I mean, if I may hear that, like one of the beautiful things that I've seen about open source is how that culture and that belief of working together is transforming not only software, but lots of different things. If you think about Creative Commons and art, remixing music, etc., all of that spawns from that same kind of culture. This idea that there is a common place where people build things and put bricks in there, and then everyone can sort of use them and rely on them.
Absolutely. And the next question, which is my last one, you've covered some of that previously with your story and how you got into open source. But if somebody were to ask, how to start contributing to open source, where do I start? What would your suggestion be to them?
So that's another really good question, actually. I think it depends whether that person is a software developer themselves or not. So I'm going to tackle software developers first because that's easier, right? I mean, I've mentioned that, as you just said, like to me, effective contributions are driven by your own needs, right? So I don't really like the idea of find a project and find like a first issue and go do that, because it is disconnected from the reality of your own needs. And exactly like it's hard to learn something when you're in school and you don't see how it connects to your world, and it's a lot easier to do something that you really want to do. It's the same for open source, right? And so if you're a developer, like my suggestion would be the next time you're building on top of an open source piece of software and there's a bug, and trust me, there are bugs in software everywhere, in open source and in non-open source code, right? The cool thing about open source is when that happens, you can actually go fix it. The next time you bump into a problem, go fix it instead of complaining about it. Go figure out how to fix it. Go ask, say, on an issue tracker of the project, hey, I'm having this weird thing here. I think it's a bug. Can you point me to like how it could, like, what does it look like? What I could do to fix this? Is this something that's easily doable for me, like someone that's not really aware of how the internals of that project works? So that's what I would really suggest for developer, is to focus on fixing a problem that you're bumping into, because that's very concrete, very helpful. It's just, you get like a big win out of it right away, and you like really start the ball rolling. If you are not a developer, it is a bit more complex. one of the things that I'm upset about open source community is that we're very much focused on code. And that's a little bit of a shame. Because there's a lot more to software than code. So sort of like, I mean, that's what my whole life is, my whole career is about, essentially, right? And so I think, like, I don't have a really good answer for this. There are plenty, though. If you're an organization, you can figure out how to help change for example, the policies in your organization to make open source contributions easier. If you're a tech writer, you can contribute documentation. If you're a designer, you can try to figure out how you can help a particular project that you're relying on. Or so it's more complex, but I also I think it's doable, but more complex. I don't have a good sort of like first next step for like non-coders, unfortunately. That's something that as a community, we need to think about more and fix, I think.
Yeah, I like that. I've seen a lot of people start when they're not technical with documentation or localization. Usually those are just text files that you can translate. I did that for one of the projects I worked on in my early days where I didn't really know how to code. I certainly didn't. It was on a Palm, actually, and I really didn't know how to code anything on Palms, but I did know how to translate from French to English. So, you know, kind of thing that you can do very easily. And I like what you said about asking the community, you know, can you guide me to how I could look at this bug and try to fix it? Most communities definitely are helpful. So they will.
Not all, but most, yes.
Yeah, most. That's what I said, most.
And again, right, it goes back to human communications, right? And thinking to some degree about this, I don't like to say that, but thinking about this in transactional terms a little bit, which is that another way of saying it is think about what's in it for the maintainer of the project, not only for yourself, right? Yeah. So if you're going to ask them for a lot of work to fix something that they don't really care about, well, think about how that, you know, how you would like that if you were on the receiving end of a request like this, right? So it's really about trying to balance your own needs and desire to learn with what you can give to the project or to the people behind the project in exchange for that. And if that transaction works well, there's a real way for that transaction to be a benefit for the project, where they get a problem fixed that they just didn't even know existed. You get your problem fixed and you've learned something in the process. And the next time, you know how to, you're more effective at helping out that project.
Cool. Okay.
So yeah.
Well, Tobie, thank you very much for your time during this recording. Very insightful. Lots of information for our audience. I appreciate that very much. I'll be putting this online very soon. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. This was great. As you can see, I'm very passionate about these topics.
I can see that. Thanks.
Thank you.